welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about how we went about developing a response to human trafficking from the government perspective in the province of British Columbia. I'm well aware that I have drawn the after lunch, afternoon nap time slot, so I'll do my best to make this as interesting as possible. It's a bit of a historic journey, and hopefully I can get this to work. Yes, there we go. The Office to Combat Trafficking in Persons opened in 2007 in Victoria. But prior to that, what led up to opening the office was an invitation from BC's first RCMP Human Trafficking Awareness Coordinator, a fellow named Norm Massey, who was taking on responsibility for the recent changes at that time to the criminal code that brought in offenses around trafficking issues. And he very quickly realized that in his new role, he had no knowledge at all of where services would be for women, should he be in a situation where he'd come across a trafficking situation. He didn't know about transition houses or community organizations. It was not in his line of work. So he asked the provincial government through the Victim Services Branch to partner with him on an initiative to look at human trafficking, to meet with community organizations, and to see what the knowledge was of the extent of trafficking across our province. So for 2.5 years, roughly 2 years, he and I worked closely going around the province and meeting with transition house workers, child protection agencies, youth organizations, immigrant settlement organizations, migrant worker groups, and learned very quickly that there was on-the-ground knowledge and experience with trafficking cases in a lot of communities, primarily in Vancouver, though, and in the Lower Mainland. So 2 ministries at that point decided that there was enough of an issue, and that's the Child Protection Ministry and the Victim Services Public Safety Ministry, to put some resources behind it in the way of money and staff. And we opened with 2 people in Victoria in 2007. The office still exists. It is much bigger. It grew to be much bigger. Then it was reduced again in 2011, unfortunately, and that had a lot of media attention at the time, so perhaps you all know about it. It is now only funded by BC's Ministry of Justice. At the time that we established the office, we gave ourselves a mandate with the help of the community organizations who we had worked with. And just to go back to that period in time, we had about 40 groups who continued to be very involved in helping us draft and design an office around the issue, so that it was not hidden away in a policy shop somewhere in government. It was very much a community government effort to give this office basically some meat on the bones so that it had some significance around the issue of trafficking. So it was jointly agreed by everyone that what our focus needed to be is what I hear you're really just focused on now in Ontario, which is absolutely fabulous. And it sounds to me like you're even further ahead than we were able to manage in BC before the office was reduced. But to build networks of provincial response services for trafficked persons, networks in communities around the province. At the government level, working with other parts of government, primarily health and education, immigration and labor, to look for gaps and barriers in existing policies and legislation that would prevent trafficking persons from coming and receiving the services that they required. And as an office, we began to be involved with the federal government, the RCMP at the federal level, and Justice Department, Public Safety on national and international efforts, including prosecutions to eliminate human trafficking. And as was mentioned by Susan, one of the things that we were able to do after a couple of years was to garner some federal funding from public safety to develop Canada's first human trafficking training online. This is a very squished view of page 1 of the training, but it is accessible online. It took us quite some time to get to this point, so there's a few steps in here that I need to mention as well. Once we applied for the funding from the federal government, we went back to that same group of 40 agencies to ask them to partner with us on developing training that was going to be relevant to the service providers who were really in the front lines of coming across trafficked individuals. So we worked with a consulting group and a company that drafts curriculum, to come up with Canada's first and only online trafficking awareness raising and training curriculum, and it's about a 7 or 8 hour self-paced training that individuals or groups can go through, and it'll come to the end, helps communities design the kind of networks that they will need to respond to trafficking in their midst. But why BC? We need to go back a couple of years, even before the Palermo Protocol was drafted, to understand why BC felt this was such an issue at the time that I got involved myself. So in 1999, and I'm sure probably a lot of you remember this incident, we had what came to be known as the Summer of the Boats, where 4 boats from Fujian province in China arrived off of our shore and landed close to 600 people over 3 or 4 months. The 4 boats were intercepted at sea or either on the coast. Throughout that series of events, 134 children who were traveling either without guardians or parents came into the care of the Child Protection Ministry, the Ministry of Children and Family Development. And a migrant services team was created to deal with all of their needs. Now, what's significant about this is it predates the Palermo Protocol. It predates the legislation that the federal government came up with. It predates the amendments to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which brought in the temporary resident permit. So none of the inhabitants of these 4 boats were viewed as victims of trafficking at that time. So it was, in retrospect, a great deal of learning for us. But the 134 kids actually all made claims for refugee status. They were all brought into ministry care, as I said, and provided with the guardianship of the ministry's child protection system, and placed in 2 fairly large resources, one in Vancouver and one in Victoria. During the ensuing year, their claims were all heard, and other than 1 child, they were all denied. Now, it certainly had never been the intention of these kids to be detained or held. They weren't detained, actually. They were put into foster care type settings in group homes as well. But they hadn't planned to be intercepted in Vancouver. None of them had. So their intention was to make it across either the US or Canada and down into the eastern US, where a lot of them did have families. But they were in our care for a year as their claims wound their way through the refugee claim system. And as I said, all but 1 child had their claims denied. And that 1 child had not set out as an unaccompanied minor, as they were known. He had set out with his mother, and she had died on the voyage and was buried at sea. And he was given the protection of Canada's refugee system. The others were not. So they, during the time in our care, were under incredible pressure from their parents to move on. So they fled. They started to flee in small groups, and within about 3 or 4 weeks after the final refugee hearing was held, they were all gone. Now, despite the fact that they had been in our care a long time, most of them still did want to move on, but they had made some very strong relationships with the social work and other caregivers, and so we kept in touch with a significant number of those children for the next couple of years, most of them ending up in either Boston or Chicago or New York City for the most part. So why are we looking at that? And I'll just highlight something that happened at the time, and it really fits with what Loli was saying we're experiencing now, a very unwelcoming attitude towards refugee claimants in our country. Really, the headlines got more outrageous with each boat that arrived, and you would have thought we were on the brink of some war. But we'd like to think that it would be somewhat different now. We're not so sure. But why are we looking at that now that we're talking about trafficking? Because if that incident happened now, we would say that these are victims of human trafficking. The children in particular, all of them had had their documents removed. Most of them claimed to have come against their wishes. They were not anxious to leave. And most significantly, they were in enormous debt. Debt bondage, some of them to the tune of $50,000 to $60,000 US, had been put out on their behalf to make this voyage over the Pacific Ocean, and we felt they were in situations that were going to lead to exploitation in order to be able to repay any of those debts. But during the time they were with us, what we found, and what our learning really was the significant number of needs that these youth had. And very quickly, we came together with service providers to make sure that those needs were met depending on what each individual child presented to us. So in no particular order, these were the services that came together, each one of those boxes having behind it service providers or government departments that came very quickly to meet the needs of the children in our care. And I would say probably healthcare was very, very high on the list. One of the boats had been on the high seas for about 2 months, and some of these kids were extremely ill. But housing, translation services, legal services, they all played significant roles in meeting the needs of these kids at this particular time. What guided us in our development of services, this was brand new for us, despite the fact that the ministry in BC has anywhere close to 9,000 children in their care on any given day. To have 134 children with these unique needs arrive on very short notice really set things in motion that hadn't been dealt with previously. So we looked to other jurisdictions and other guiding principles for ensuring services were appropriate for this kind of a situation. And there's two very key principles in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that were guiding documents for us: ensure appropriate protection and assistance for children seeking refugee status, and provide the same protection as any other child deprived of his or her family. So in other words, they were incorporated into our child protection system and given the same sort of guardianship and legal representation that other children in our care received. When it came to the UN Palermo Protocol and back to working with Norm Massey and looking at how to create a response in British Columbia, the Palermo Protocol was drafted in 2000, ratified by Canada in 2003, with 4 pillars: prevention of trafficking in persons, protection of victims of trafficking, prosecution of offenders, and partnerships of stakeholders. And we focus very much on the protection of victims of trafficking and building partnerships around, with stakeholders around this particular issue. It's not something that any one agency, any one department of government can work on alone. It requires a significant number of partners to ensure that the needs are appropriately met of trafficked individuals coming to someone's attention. The UN Declaration of Human Rights has also been mentioned today a number of times, and it played a significant role as a founding principle for the Office to Combat Trafficking in Persons, also with 2 very significant clauses: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Really important guiding pieces of legislation for us. The human rights approach also mentioned quite a bit this morning, and it was an underpinning of both the services we developed for the children back in 1999 and the services we began to pull together in 2007 when we opened the office, recognizing that human trafficking is a violation of rights, that individuals need care and assistance in regaining control of their lives, be in a position to present fair and reasonable life options, and deliver justice and redress for trafficked persons. In setting up the Office to Combat Trafficking in Persons, we looked worldwide for other similar initiatives that were on the way or undergoing at that time. And we looked in particular to the United Kingdom, where they had a very interesting campaign, and still do, called Blue Blindfold campaign. This is focused on raising awareness of the issue of human trafficking to ordinary citizens across the country. And for an extensive time period, a couple of years ago, it was difficult to go into the UK without seeing this campaign. It was very widespread and really came from the premise of take off your blindfold, look and see what's going on behind you or beside you, and look for human trafficking situations where you might not have thought they would exist otherwise. With the youth focus, the US has developed several campaigns that we had learned a great deal from. One in particular called Look Beneath the Surface, with the same premise: look around you and see what might have looked ordinary previously, but it could actually be a trafficking situation. So we've done, over the years that OCTIP was operating, we've done a significant amount of awareness raising and training around the province of BC prior to actually developing the online component. We've been in schools, we've been in community organizations, transition houses, government departments, anywhere that there was a spot that we felt was likely to be a likely location that trafficking could be occurring. And certainly youth, teachers in the education system is very interested in knowing what more they could learn about strategies that might be happening right on a schoolyard. So we've talked a lot about looking at Facebook and Twitter and the use of social media for recruiting young girls, young men, luring and grooming by boyfriends. Certainly lots of situations were brought to our attention that we talked through with people on the phone. Drugs and other girls who are used as recruiting tools on the schoolyards. Over the years, we've had a significant number of opportunities to be involved in meeting trafficked individuals or working with the RCMP, Border Services, others, to try and identify what concerns may be prevalent when you come across a trafficked person. So the cases that we were involved in, and I can mention a couple, one of the very early ones that we were asked to become involved in was a woman who was intercepted at the Vancouver airport traveling from Japan to Peru. And her suitcase was full of lingerie, something that raised the attention of the Border Services, and her documents were not seen to be true or appeared fraudulent. So we met with the woman at the airport, and on further investigation, it became apparent that the first thing she needed was some dental care. She couldn't speak to anyone about what her situation was, and we were able to arrange some pro bono dental care. Then we had a conversation with her, and things unfolded as we anticipated. I think they were on the verge, and I know they were, of returning her to Japan. She had legitimate reasons to be going onwards to Peru, but she had been detained, and no one could have a conversation with her because of her dental issues. And that was just one area that we were able to find some pro bono assistance for this woman, and what could have otherwise had a very different outcome was fairly straightforward in the end. We've heard this morning about the unique vulnerabilities of Aboriginal people. One of the very first things we were able to do once we'd opened our Vancouver office, which was about a year later, was to bring on an Aboriginal staff member, a woman who had very strong connections into the foster care system, into Aboriginal organizations around the province, and helped us develop a domestic trafficking strategy. Most of the work we had been done had been focused on looking at people coming in across an international border into our province. We hadn't concentrated much of our time and our energy or our resources on looking into the domestic situation in British Columbia and the movement of Aboriginal girls and women, primarily from remote locations in the north into urban centers around Vancouver. And some of the reasons that this was happening, and I know we've heard some of them, and certainly poverty, although it's bottom of the list there, is very high. Poor public transportation systems, fragmented families. She's worked very closely with Aboriginal communities in locations that really, I think she was the only one of our team who could move in and build the relationships with the Aboriginal communities and start to talk about what they were seeing about the girls that were moving out of their communities. So the service model we finally developed was built around and modeled on the services, the model we created originally for the children who came into our care all those years beforehand. It seemed like the right combination of services and service providers for developing a system of responding to the needs of trafficked individuals as they came to our attention. This model exists today. It's bigger than it was certainly originally. We have more and more service providers in behind each one of those service sectors. And this is a model, we always say, that can be implemented in any community, either large or small. You're going to have some components of each one of those services in your community, with the ability to come together and create a network that can be available on short notice to respond to situations of human trafficking. In all the years that we've done presentations out of the office, probably the most common question that would come to us is, what can I do? What can I do as an individual? And I think what we suggest, I know what we suggest now that the training is available, is to educate yourself through online training, through whatever material is out there. But learn what it is, what the indicators of trafficking are, what the situations are that you may, as I said earlier, not recognize as trafficking, but on second glance or with further training and awareness and education, you may actually be encountering a traffic situation, perhaps the nanny next door, the persons working in the back of a restaurant. There are many, many situations that could be labeled as trafficking on further investigation. So that's the lead to the training, octip.ca. It's on, as I said, online, and has just been translated into French as well with the assistance of the federal government. And thank you. I went through that very quickly.